Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Mastena Nazarian, an Alexander Technique teacher in Melbourne, Australia. She has a background in music. She's done a lot of work in martial arts. Her teaching practice there consists a lot of musicians and also other members of the general public. And we're going to talk today about I think we're going to title this podcast Alexander Technique Jargon 101. And we're going to talk about three key phrases that are often used by Alexander Technique teachers, and maybe try to clarify them or make them more accessible. So, Mastana, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Robert.
Well, it's a pleasure. This is our third podcast of the evening, so we're moving right along. Um, so I know you have three terms that you want to talk about. Could you say what they are, and then we'll get to each one in turn?
Yeah, yeah, sure. One is Alexander used the word or borrowed it from the neurologist he was working with. One's called inhibition,
Right. Mm-hmm.
and the other term that he used was direction.
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing is a phrase, a means whereby.
Okay. And we should say there are other terms out there that you'll run into, but we're just going to start with these three.
Hmm.
Which one do you want to talk about first?
Well, we could talk about inhibition. That's always.
That's the that is typically considered the most challenging thing to explain, don't you think?
Mm,
Yeah, I mean, I think we should say first off that it has nothing to do with Freudian inhibition, right?
that's right.
Repression. There's no repression implied.
No.
So, what would you say to someone who studying the Alexander technique and has come across that term that might help them understand it a little better? And I'll jump in too from time to time.
Well, if it's in a teaching situation, I engage them in a skill or an activity that they're interested in,
Mm-hmm.
and usually it just comes up by itself. I'll ask them to, for example, pick up something and say, "Well, we observed what happened. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
we've been working for a few sessions," and then actually, it usually comes up in the first session by itself, and I'll say, "Can you do this activity again and start started by moving this joint first, for example?" And the
Mm-hmm.
person is like, is there, they're happy, they're breathing, their heart rate hasn't changed, but they simply cannot do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's just they're not shocked, they're not about to strangle anything or anyone. They simply cannot do what I asked them to do, and then they know that they can,
Mm-hmm.
but there's like some sort of rebooting or reconfiguration happening in their brain or in their system, their whole system, that is getting in the way of them just jumping in and doing that activity the way they always done it. So
Right.
they're almost it's kind of really beautiful to be in the presence of, because it's kind of like they've expanded quite a bit. Whether
Mm-hmm.
I can see it or not, I can feel that they've expanded. Well, I can sense that there's something changing,
Mm-hmm.
and they're noticing themselves, and a whole host of other private like layers of thought might be going on in their head. That's their own business. And then I sort of take time and say, well, Alexander called this ability to stop and notice inhibition.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
or I might not say the word inhibition, but this ability to stop and notice will aid you the next time you're faced with public speaking or playing your music or whatever it might be that they're interested in. So, and the person seems to engage in themselves in a kind of a constructive way a lot better if they're engage with an activity that they're interested in. So it's
Right,
like
right.
even yeah.
So sometimes inhibition is presented as say no to what you want to do, right? And it sounds like you approach it a little differently than that.
Well, I think it's a funny thing. Huh. It's a funny thing that no, actually, human beings are inhibiting all the time.
Right. I think in neuroscience, in inhibition, and in the sense that we're talking about, at a very deep level, is considered crucial to effective mental functioning.
Yeah, so I think it's happening all the time
Mm-hmm.
in habitual in by habitual I don't mean anything negative at all,
Mm-hmm.
and day-to-day activity.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that if in order to gain a better environment for the nervous system, whether it's for healing an injury
Mm-hmm.
or gain a better environment for the nervous system and the whole person in order to improve performance, improve learning. Uh, it's it's beneficial to expand on what nature is actually already doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'll just read a little bit from Alexander's writing.
Okay.
Um, on a general and preventative basis, so that it is preventative for me means that we're not doing anything extra, we're just noticing what's already there.
Mm-hmm.
On a general and preventative basis, and the process of inhibition involved in employing direct attempts to gain an end, but associated instead with that indirect procedures inseparable from the practical application of the principles concerned with the means whereby an end may be gained. So to me, that's a perfect sentence to have to inhibit afterwards.
Right. Oh, because I think the average person reading that will have no idea what he's talking about. Don't you
Yeah,
think? I mean, that's Alexander in his wordy,
exactly. So
wordy
that's why we're
sense.
having this conversation.
Right. So how would you, if I may use the word, deconstruct that sentence? What's he
Decon
saying?
Well, he's basically, to me, today, he's saying that he basically is interested in what we can do less of. So the functioning of the nervous system and the engagement with our activity as humans can have more scope and more ease to it. So what can we strengthen in order for us to be able to use what nature has already given us in a more cohesive way?
Okay. Yeah. And
So
and how do we do that?
how do we how do
Strengthen that thing.
well by improving our relationship and understanding to of movement,
Mm-hmm.
because in that is our relationship and an understanding of our thinking as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. And can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, if we do it kind of like a very old-fashioned physiotherapy exercise, sort of devoid of life and very mechanical, that will have a certain kind of strengthening of the natural ability of the nervous system, or we can learn to engage with the activities of daily life in a more fluid way by improving our direction, which is the next word we want to come to.
Mm-hmm. But sort of an operational definition of inhibition in terms of actually, if you were to try to tell someone how can I actually inhibit those patterns I don't want, what would you say is the way to do that?
Well, the indirect way,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
And uh, by just sort of being curious about how it is that we write or type or kick a ball, and finding out how we can bring more um, engagement with the process of the activity rather than getting the sentence out on the piece of paper or typing the email or getting the ball into the goal, but engaging with the process that we're involved in order to um,
So it's a
gain.
little bit letting go of the need to get the thing done and be more interested in how we're doing that thing.
Yeah,
Is that,
so
yeah?
so the phrase that we talked about before, the means whereby,
Mm-hmm.
uh, really ties in inhibition and direction
Mm-hmm.
into sort of a circle that we can enter at any point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you think people can learn that on their own, or is that they're gonna probably need to see an Alexander teacher?
Well, I don't know. It depends on the person, really.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on the person.
Right.
It depends on how keen they are and how what motivates them, to
Mm-hmm.
wanna learn how to learn. Because
Mm-hmm.
if we haven't noticed that we have the ability to stop and notice,
Mm-hmm.
we kind of maybe lose on the whole vitality thing a little bit. So if
Right.
someone is interested in learning how to learn, then that itself means that they're ready to learn how to notice better in a more cohesive and constructive way.
Well, and you certainly have to be willing to experiment, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
you have to, as Marge Barstow used to say, be willing to take a gambling chance. You're gonna to change the way to learn how to change the way you're thinking. You've got to be willing to change the way you're thinking, I guess, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it's just sort of going into the unknown a bit, isn't it?
yeah. It's totally going into the unknown. I think for
And
a lot of people,
here's another classic FM Alexander Cohn,
right?
is to go from right to wrong,
Mm-hmm.
is to go from the known to the unknown. So the unknown's going to feel kind of wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and you gotta be safe in your structure to a certain extent, or to be to want to go there. No one can make you learn any of this. No one
No,
can no one can
you
push you.
can't force feed the Alexander technique on people. That's true. But so you're saying you need to be willing to, at least for a short period of time, feel like you're doing something incorrectly and still and be okay with that, at least for a bit, right?
But yeah, to have that new
That
experience.
may feel very
Yeah,
strange. Yeah. Okay.
yeah. But
Right.
in the same sense, it feels full of vitality and support and
Right. Right.
positivity. Even if that feels unfamiliar and new,
Mm-hmm.
um, if it's really in line with all if all the different ways of getting to notice better and to learn to inhibit, in what Alexander's terms was anyway,
Mm-hmm.
somehow meet all the different ways from different cultures and different movement and thinking practices out there in the world, if they're all have anything in common, is that there's an element of safety.
Mm-hmm.
There's an element of going into the unknown, but there is some kind of connection and safety is there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, for example, I've had conversations with people who have been in a situation of pain and discomfort that is perhaps taken them to uh, one of the better known therapies out there, and they say, "Gosh, but I had to experience such incredible physical pain,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure that made my muscle release
Mm-hmm.
or something like that." And I'm always sort of become a little bit more humble and see what they want to say next. And I don't have anything to add to that. And it's like, well, that person was sold on pain as a form of change.
Right.
uh,
Or
and
people can be sold on, in order to change, you've got to do something um, active, like
yeah,
some act. You've got to do something. Actually, if we're, as long as we're quoting the great guy, Alexander, uh, somewhere, not in one of his books, but elsewhere, said something like, the problem is none of my students will believe that it's just a thought.
hmm,
That they're all, he said, they're all slaves to muscular activity.
hmm.
They feel like they got to do something to solve a problem.
And
So,
actually, I think that's not as bad as thinking that you're a slave to someone else pushing and pounding into your muscles for
well,
you.
yeah, yeah. Well, what?
and
Yeah,
and for you to have to experience pain to the level of even uh surgery for you
mm-hmm.
to become well again, so for
Right.
your muscles to learn how to become well again.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the the little golden nugget that's inside the word inhibition is that it's actually you have control
Mm-hmm.
through
Right.
the through what nature has given you as a holistic organism. You
Mm-hmm.
have the ability to make shifts and have control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you're presented with learning this skill in a safe and cohesive manner, then you be able to, at least emotionally jump higher and run faster.
Right. Right. Right.
Until you're to a point where it, like, let's say you're a runner and suffering from ankle injury,
Right.
until you're a point where you can physically jump higher and run faster
Right.
because
Right.
you've learned to listen and notice better. So,
Right.
yeah.
So let's move on to direction. If that's the next one you want to go to,
Sure,
or
yeah.
maybe means whereby, since that is kind of connected with inhibition. Well, everything's connected. Would
Yeah.
Go where you want to go, and I'll follow.
Okay, well, direction and means whereby and inhibition, as you said, are very deeply connected. And but in the same way, it's useful to separate them in order to better integrate
Mm-hmm.
these skills.
Mm-hmm.
So it means whereby, as we mentioned before, is really about taking the attention away from the end goal
Mm-hmm.
and just being a little bit almost like more childlike about observing what we've got in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
if it's a musician with dealing with injury in the
Mm-hmm.
shoulder or in their wrist, then rather than really, really being concerned about getting out of pain seems to be the only thing that is preoccupying the person to a point that it's almost maybe creating more pain.
Mm-hmm.
Is how can they just stop and notice the shape of their hand?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And
Right.
and do they really know where the thumb starts from, for example?
Mm-hmm.
And have a few simple, engage themselves in a few simple experiments of noticing simple movement of, for example, looking uh, looking at their hand from the back and folding their fingers and noting where that movement starts from.
Mm-hmm.
and then turning their hand around and looking at the palm and doing the same and guessing from the palm side where the finger's first joint is, and
Hmm.
then moving the hand, and lo and behold, whoa, they were, off by about 1.5 centimeters.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So engaging in a little bit more simplicity in the face of this greater problem. I've got a big concert coming up in, you know,
So
6 weeks
so
time, and I can't play my instruments. What do I do? So
right. So
yeah,
you're saying, well, I got this concert coming up. I can't play. Maybe I should just play with my hand, right?
hmm,
Just explore how fingers and thumbs and wrists and elbows and whatever work.
yeah,
In other words, be interested in the process that I'm going to use when I do go to play down the road,
yeah,
and not
yeah.
worry about the playing right now.
Yeah, and at that point, if the person is in a quite a mind, body, and spiritual knot,
Hmm.
they might want to seek the skills of an Alexander Technique teacher or movement therapist, movement
Hmm. Hmm.
educator,
Hmm.
um, to find out uh, some better insight into what their habits are when they are looking at their hands. So some
Hmm.
people, you get someone who's in a lot of pain or is experiencing this uh, sort of all this twistedness in their muscles and bones and nervous system. And if they look at their hand, they'll be like, "Oh my God, my mom always said your pinky was longer than it should be." It
Right.
could be,
Yeah.
it could be that their thoughts are so fixed into
Right.
what's wrong and what's going to go wrong that
Right.
they're trying to gain an end. And so the means whereby is a process where they can come back into just observing things a little bit more in a more childlike way and with
Right.
less extra coloring, you know?
Right. And I think someone who's in pain may not be able to actually manage that kind of
Yeah,
self-observation too easily
yeah,
without a bit of outside help.
sure.
It you know, I think typically Alexander teacher confronted with someone who's in a lot of pain is not going to ask them to do a lot of thinking. They're going to simply guide them into a easier relationship,
Hmm.
because I think that's kind of all they could deal with at that point.
Yeah,
But that does accomplish exactly the thing you were just talking about, and sets the stage for them to be able to do it themselves.
exactly, because
Yeah.
they've been engaged fully. And
Right. And they
so
just need a little help from outside. That's not,
yeah,
it's like
yep.
coaching, really. How about directions? We have a quick word or two about directions.
Yeah, it's a bit like self-coaching, isn't it?
Yes.
Except if you call yourself a life coach and sort of present those same ideas to through the cognitive behavioral model,
Right.
it's somehow easier to sell.
Right.
But with the Alexander technique uh, process
Mm-hmm.
or the way we engage with the person, it's probably not that different from a good cognitive behavioral therapist. But with direction, I suppose we're asking of ourselves uh, it's sort of variety of ways we can engage with the environment in a simple way,
Yeah.
in a
I
simpler way, really.
It's kind of
Yeah.
a talking to yourself, and
Hmm.
they're different. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of directions. I mean, the whole
Mm.
what you could call Alexander technique directing technology has gone has I say I use that deliberately, but has gone through a lot of changes in the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, if
Sure.
you go back to Alexander's own writing and the directions that Alexander used, say in the 30s, were you know neck to be free, back to lengthen and widen, blah, blah, blah. It's like 3 sentences worth. And people would go crazy trying to deploy those.
Mm.
And then Alexander would say, well, it's one after the other all at the same time. People would spend years trying to do that. Well, I think a lot of that is that those problems have been taken care of by
Mm.
much simpler, more direct, and more effective directions that can be
Yep.
very, very simple
Mm.
and more powerful. But they are things that you request of you say to yourself, and there are
Yep.
different ways of looking at what that process is about. My current take is that in a freedom direction, for example, like I am free, or my neck is free, or my breathing is free, is really you just saying what you want, and with no intent to implement it, but to simply outsource any implementation to lower level systems that really you don't have to have any great interest in.
Mm.
I see it as just, or insourcing, depending on how you look at it. But I mean, it's saying this is what I want. You guys figure it out. And the amazing thing is that those guys do figure it out, and they figure it out instantly. I
Well, yeah,
mean,
yeah,
they've been
it's
waiting for you to ask them. you know, they're just sitting
yeah,
there. Why hasn't he said that before? Or
yeah,
thought that before?
yeah, it takes me back to how we coordinate with as parents, It's like there's a lot of talk around what do I do for the kid to listen better? What do
Mm-hmm.
I do to be heard? What do I do this, that?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, well, there are many, 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 many different ways, but it starts with yourself. It starts
Yep.
with yourself as a parent. Where are you when you're asking
Right.
something from your child?
What's your
So,
mental state in asking that?
yeah, and I suppose in the sort of a current tech universe where to actually bring the physical and the mental together is becoming a lot more popular because we can scientifically prove that they coexist somehow,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Oh,
But
yeah. I mean, we now know, we can measure that
yeah,
there's no
exactly.
such thing as a pure thought. There's always a physical correlate.
Yeah,
It may
exactly.
be very tiny, but it's there, and there's no such thing as a movement without some mental activity. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So I think,
your example with parenting is really interesting because there are a lot of ways that you can say what you want to your kids, and some of them are going to be a lot more effective than others. And it's the same thing with directions. The wording could be exactly the same, but if you're saying, oh, my neck is free, and you're thinking of that in terms of something I got to really push through and make
yep,
happen,
yep,
it's not going to happen. Or if you think of it as um, uh, or yeah, I mean that's an
yep,
example. Like you're saying to yourself, do it or else. You're not going to get any kind of useful result from that. But if you
yeah,
say, this is what I want, and I'll let you figure out how to make it happen, or and you're very light about it, and you're not being pushy about it.
yep.
It's very powerful, and I don't have a lot of experience with small kids, but I would think it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like engaging yourself
Hmm.
as you're engaging with the child, and this is just an example.
Yeah.
Um, and if it doesn't work, once or twice, you're asking them to clean up something or,
Hmm.
get to the dinner table or basically asking them how was their day and stuff like that. And then and then if you're not getting a response, you just got to stop, go back to that first step to do with inhibition that
Hmm. Hmm.
and just say, wait a minute, do I do I know why I'm asking them? Am I asking them how was their day because then I could tell my friends how my child is more responsive than theirs, you know? Or can
Right.
I just or can I actually just engage in how they are,
Right. Right.
and just be okay with the fact that, you know, they've they've had 8 hours at school,
Mm-hmm.
and and they're telling me how their day is by the way they walk, the way they move, the way they're
Mm-hmm.
engaging in their footsteps,
Mm-hmm.
and are words really even that necessary?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
takes me to an idea, or a story that I like to share, is that um, with direction and inhibition and direction and means whereby, yeah, the freedom directions I think are incredibly useful. I've used them myself, especially dealing with anxiety, and hey, it works.
Mm-hmm.
It's
They,
it's incredibly useful. And then on the I suppose on the other side of that, we always have gravity to contend with. And so in regards to direction, there's an easier way to organize with gravity,
mm-hmm.
and there's a correct way to organize with gravity.
Mm-hmm.
So even though direction or directing yourselves can be approached from many different ways, there is this sense of correct. And that sense of correct is actually noticing and learning how we can take the path of least resistance
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
How to use gravity to our advantage.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I was at a martial arts practice, and our teacher was doing a lesson on the path of least resistance. And look, he just 65-year-old man. He just had triple bypass, so he got one leg that works, and the other leg is basically bone on bone at the hip joint. And he's got, and to me, he's got the most fantastic way of using himself,
Mm-hmm.
and the most fantastic way of expressing the idea of inhibition, direction, and the means whereby. And I said, I had a question. I said, Sensei, what are you thinking in yourself when you're approaching the path of least resistance in in effect to the your opponent's attack, your
Mm-hmm.
opponent's energy? And he just stops and smiles and says, nothing. I'm just thinking, don't get killed.
Yeah. Well.
And so there's I suppose the positive directions and the freedom directions
Mm-hmm.
and all
Well,
these wonderful layers, and then there's this other direction to say, just don't get killed. Don't
right.
stop breathing and don't look down.
Well, that's kind of a meta direction, and he's staying with the big picture and letting the details take care of themselves, right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
suppose, but it definitely was a good demonstration
Yeah.
of how simple it can really be if we
Exactly. It can be
just
unbelievably
yeah,
simple.
just get on board and realize that
Yeah.
these things already exist within our system.
This
Um,
I'm thinking this, given the time, that this might be a good time to end, but I think we should leave it that we've talked about these three things: inhibition, direction, means whereby. We obviously haven't covered everything about them, and we haven't uh, talked about other Alexander terms. So anyone listening, I'm going to post this as a podcast fairly soon. Anyone listening who has questions about these that maybe we could deal with in another podcast, we could perhaps do a part two where we talk about some other jargon terms.
Sounds good.
Yeah, because we don't want jargon. There isn't actually a huge amount of Alexander technique jargon, but what there is, we don't want that to
Yeah.
to prevent a real understanding of the work. You
Yes.
know, I think that's the danger of any kind of jargon.
Mm.
Okay, so my guest today has been Mastena Nazarian, an Alexander Technique teacher in Melbourne, Australia. Mastena, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks